The world was quiet on the morning Mohandas entered it, the sun still stretching its early light across the coastal town of Porbandar. The sea whispered against the shore, as if offering a gentle welcome to the fragile child wrapped in thin white cloth. His mother held him with a serene devotion, and in that small house filled with the scent of sandalwood and the sound of temple bells drifting from faraway lanes, no one suspected that this tiny boy would one day carry the weight of an entire nation on his shoulders. Mohandas grew in a home where faith was woven into the walls. His mother's voice sang soft prayers at dawn. His father spoke rarely, but when he did, his words carried a calm authority. Through the window of their modest house, the streets of Porbandar glimmered with early sunlight, children running barefoot in dusty lanes, traders arranging baskets of spices glowing with color, the sea breeze carrying a salty breath through narrow pathways. Mohandas was a shy child. He walked with uncertain steps, often clinging to his mother's sari when unfamiliar faces entered their home. He was gentle in a world filled with noise. He preferred quiet corners, where he watched the patterns of light fall across the floor, or listened to the muffled sounds of waves reaching the shore. He feared the dark, he feared being alone, and most of all, he feared disappointing those he loved. His world was soft, simple, and sheltered. But life never stays gentle for long. The boy who clung to silence soon found himself stepping into years that demanded courage. As he grew older, Mohandas moved through childhood like someone trying to understand where he belonged. School frightened him at first. His voice trembled when teachers called his name. He often avoided the loud groups of boys who played rough games in the courtyard. He wasn't ready for the world, and the world didn't wait for him. Still, he walked through those days with a quiet determination, holding tightly to the values whispered to him at home: truth, discipline, humility. Time pushed him forward as it always does. By the time Mohandas became a young man, the paths of life were no longer soft and predictable. His father passed away, leaving the young Mohandas with a heaviness he had never known. In those days of grief, the nights felt longer, and even the familiar sea sounded distant. His mother, despite her own sorrow, gathered her strength to guide him. She believed that education could shape his future, could give his soft heart the direction it needed. And so, with hesitant steps, Mohandas boarded a ship to England to study law. The journey by sea felt endless. Day and night dissolved into the sound of waves slamming against the ship's wood, the sky shifting from bright blue to star-filled darkness. Mohandas often stood alone at the deck, the wind brushing against his face, carrying the taste of salt and distance. He looked at the horizon and felt both excitement and fear. England was a world completely different from the one he knew. Cold winds, tall buildings, strangers with sharp accents, and streets that moved faster than his thoughts. In London, Mohandas walked with his head lowered, trying to blend into a city that did not know him. He struggled to fit into its rhythm, its rules, its expectations. He dressed the way others dressed. He spoke carefully, afraid of being mocked. At night, in his small room lit by a dim lamp, he read endlessly, the pages rustling softly as the hours slipped past. He wanted to be more than the timid boy from Porbandar. He wanted to prove something to himself, to his family, to the future that waited somewhere ahead. But no book taught him how to find courage. Nothing in those cold English streets prepared him for what life would demand next. And then came South Africa. It was supposed to be a simple job. A legal case. A chance to earn, to learn, to stand on his own. But the moment he stepped onto that new land, the air felt different. Thicker with injustice, harsher with division. Mohandas had never seen a place where people were separated not by doors or walls, but by color. He didn't understand the silent hatred that lived in the eyes of strangers. And yet he walked forward, unaware that destiny had already taken his hand. Then came the night that would change him forever. The train rattled through the cold darkness as Mohandas sat quietly inside, holding his ticket, his breathing steady. But rules in that land didn't care about tickets or fairness. They cared only about skin. And so, without warning, he was thrown out, pushed into the icy night, his luggage tossed after him, the train pulling away like a cruel reminder that he did not belong. He stood on that lonely platform, shivering not just from the cold but from the sting of humiliation. For a long moment, he simply stared into the darkness, unable to understand how someone could be treated as less than human. A part of him wanted to weep. Another part wanted to return home. But somewhere deep inside, something else awakened, something he had never felt this strongly before. A fire. Not the kind that destroys. The kind that reveals. A fire that whispers, "Stand up." That night, something in Mohandas shifted forever. The shy boy who had spent a lifetime avoiding conflict felt a new weight in his chest, a weight made of truth, of pain, of purpose. He didn't know it yet, but this moment on the cold ground was the birthplace of the man the world would one day call Mahatma. And when the morning came, and the sun slowly rose over the land that had tried to break him, Mohandas Gandhi rose with it, quietly, steadily with it, resolve that would shake empires. The sunrise in South Africa painted the sky with colors that felt strangely new to Mohandas. Soft gold stretched across the horizon, touching the tops of quiet buildings and waking the city with a fragile warmth. Mohandas walked through the streets with steady steps, still carrying the memory of that cold night on the train. Something inside him had changed, and even the morning breeze seemed to move differently around him, as if recognizing the quiet fire that now lived in his heart. He began observing the world with sharper eyes. He saw men forced to walk on separate roads. He saw women turned away from shops. He saw children looked at with disdain simply because of the color of their skin. And everywhere he looked, he felt the same question echoing inside him. Why should any human bow to cruelty? That question grew heavier day by day, pressing against his spirit like a stone that refused to move until answered. Mohandas began meeting others who carried similar wounds, merchants, laborers, clerks, students trying to make a life in a land that treated them as shadows. In their eyes he saw fear, but he also saw hope waiting to breathe. When they gathered, they spoke in low voices, discussing their struggles, their anger, their helplessness. And though Mohandas had never led anyone before, the group often turned towards him, drawn by the calm strength in his words, the sincerity in his voice. He did not shout. He did not rage. He spoke softly, with pauses that felt like quiet lanterns guiding people through the darkness. And slowly, without planning it, he became the one they trusted, the one who could turn fear into courage. As the months passed, Mohandas found himself standing before crowds, small at first and then growing larger. He spoke about dignity, about truth, about standing firm without hatred. His voice, once trembling in childhood classrooms, now carried across open fields and echoing halls. And each time he spoke, something happened, not outside, but inside, within the hearts of those listening. They began to believe they were stronger than the chains placed around them. But change does not come without resistance. The authorities grew uneasy. They pushed back harder. Men were beaten. Women were dragged. Families lived in shadows, waiting for knocks on their doors. And yet, even in the face of fear, the people stood together, holding on to the calm strength Mohandas offered. It was not the strength of weapons or anger, it was the strength of truth. Days turned into years. Mohandas faced arrests, interrogations, threats. Each time he stepped into a prison cell, the world outside grew louder with his name. And each time he stepped out, he felt even more certain that the path he walked was the one meant for him. He was not fighting for victory. He was fighting for the soul of humanity. Then something shifted again, another turning point shaped quietly by time. News from India reached him like a distant call carried across oceans. His homeland was stirring, restless, wounded by the weight of foreign rule. And somewhere beneath that vast sorrow, a whisper rose, a whisper that India needed someone who could awaken its sleeping courage. Mohandas felt the call deep in his bones. South Africa had shown him the shape of injustice. India would show him the depth of it. He stepped aboard the ship with a heart full of uncertainty. The sea stretched endlessly around him once again, just as it had when he first left for England as a timid young man. But he was not timid anymore. The waves rolled beneath him with a rhythm that matched the determination in his chest. He stood at the deck for long hours, watching the horizon, imagining the land awaiting him. India welcomed him with noise, with dust, with crowds, with colors, everything loud and alive and overflowing. But beneath that chaos, there was something else. A quiet pain, a silent exhaustion. People bowed their heads not out of respect, but out of helplessness. Their voices were low, their hopes buried, their strength forgotten. Mohandas traveled across the country, not as a leader, but as a listener. He sat in small huts where lanterns flickered against mud walls. He walked across open fields where farmers bent under the sun. He met weavers, fishermen, laborers, widows, children, each living a story of struggle that left a mark on his heart. And he felt the same fire rising inside him, the fire that had awakened on that cold South African night. This time, it burned with a deeper purpose. He believed a nation could rise without violence. He believed truth could be sharper than any blade. He believed courage could be gentle and still powerful. And slowly, people began to believe with him. The movement began with simple steps. A meeting here, a march there, a voice raised in calm defiance. But soon, the ground beneath India felt different. It felt alive. Something was shifting, awakening, expanding, something that had slept for too long. Mohandas Gandhi, once a shy boy afraid of shadows, now walked at the front of crowds thousands strong. Their footsteps echoed like a heartbeat across villages and cities. Their voices blended into a single sound, rising through the air like a storm preparing to break. But Mohandas did not feel like a hero. He felt like a servant of a truth greater than himself. Each day he woke before dawn. Each night he lay down knowing tomorrow would demand more strength than today. His body grew thinner, but his spirit grew taller. His words became a shelter for millions. And yet, darkness still lingered ahead. Prisons waited for him. Tears waited for him. Fires of anger surrounded his path. But Gandhi walked forward with the quiet steadiness of someone who had surrendered his life to a cause larger than breath. He knew the road ahead would not be easy. He knew the world would try to break him. But he also knew one thing with absolute clarity. India was ready to rise. And he would walk beside her, no matter the cost. Gandhi's footsteps carried him into years shaped by storms. The British Raj, a power that ruled with iron certainty, watched him with growing unease. They had seen rebellions before, but nothing like this. Nothing like a man who refused weapons. Nothing like a leader whose strength came from quietness rather than rage. Gandhi's calm frightened them more than armies ever had. Villagers gathered wherever he arrived. Some walked miles barefoot just to hear his voice. They did not understand complicated politics. They understood pain. They understood hunger. They understood being ignored. And when Gandhi spoke, it felt as if someone was finally listening to the hurt hidden in their hearts. His voice moved slowly, like a river flowing through dry land. Each word carried warmth, reminding people of something they had forgotten, that they were not powerless, that they were not meant to bow forever, that freedom was not just a dream whispered in dark corners. But courage comes with a price. When Gandhi encouraged the nation to rise together, through unity, through truth, through peaceful resistance, the wave that followed shook the foundations of the empire. Markets grew silent as people refused foreign goods. Streets filled with marches. The air trembled with the sound of spinning wheels turning cotton into cloth, small hands creating a symbol of self-respect. The British responded with force. Police batons struck men who folded their hands in peace. Women were dragged for refusing to obey unjust laws. Young boys were thrown into jails that smelled of damp stone and cold iron. And Gandhi, who had promised to walk in front of his people, stepped into those prisons willingly. Bars closed behind him. Darkness surrounded him. But he remained calm, seated on the rough floor, whispering prayers that echoed softly through the silent walls. Outside, the world waited, and his name grew louder with every passing day. Prison did not weaken him. It sharpened his purpose. Each time he walked out, his resolve burned brighter. And each time he returned to the people, they welcomed him like a father coming home after a long journey. Years passed in waves, freedom movements rising, the empire tightening its grip, Gandhi being arrested again and again. His body aged. His face became thinner. Wrinkles carved themselves along his forehead like maps drawn by time itself. Yet his eyes held the same clarity, the same quiet fire that had awakened long ago on a cold South African night. Then came a moment that changed the air across India. A simple law. A tax on salt. Something so small, yet it controlled every breath of life. Gandhi saw the chain hidden inside that grain, saw how it bound the poorest people to helplessness. And he decided to break it, not with weapons, but with a walk. He stepped out from Sabarmati Ashram one early morning, the sky just beginning to change from night to day. His feet touched the earth gently, as if greeting an old friend. Behind him, a small group followed, unsure of how far this journey would go. They moved through villages where people stood in their doorways with wide eyes, watching the man they called Bapu walk past their homes with steady steps. The march grew longer. Crowds grew bigger. What began with a few men soon became a river of humanity stretching across the land. Dust rose beneath thousands of feet. Songs echoed through open fields. And Gandhi walked in silence, his wooden staff tapping the ground like a heartbeat guiding the nation forward. They walked for days, weeks, through heat, through exhaustion, through miles that tested the limits of the body. But Gandhi did not stop. With each step, the world began to listen. Newspapers across continents wrote of the old man leading a nation with nothing but truth in his hands. When he finally reached the sea at Dandi, the air was thick with anticipation. The sun glowed above the waves as Gandhi bent down slowly, his fingers touching the wet sand. And in that simple motion, he lifted a handful of salt, defying an empire with an act so small, yet so powerful, it shook the world. The Salt March was not just a protest. It was a message written on the heart of history, that no force could silence a nation that had learned to stand. The British struck back with fury. Thousands were arrested. The jails overflowed. Gandhi himself was taken again, yet he walked into the cell with the same gentle courage as before. The struggle grew harsher. Nights became heavier. The scars on India deepened. But the movement could not be broken anymore. It had gone beyond laws and punishments. It had become a spirit living in millions, a whisper that turned into a roar, telling every person that freedom was not just a dream they wished for, it was a future their footsteps were already walking toward. And in the midst of this storm, Gandhi continued his journey, thin, frail, his ribs showing beneath his simple cloth, yet his presence radiating a strength that felt larger than the world around him. He knew the final battles were approaching. He knew the road would only grow darker. But he also knew something else. India was no longer asleep. Her people had awakened. Her heart had awakened. And no empire, no law, no chain could make her bow again. The years that followed tested the soul of India in ways the world could barely understand. Every street seemed to carry the echo of marching footsteps. Every village whispered stories of sacrifice. Every prison cell held men and women who believed in a future brighter than the darkness around them. And at the center of it all, walking with quiet determination, was Gandhi, frail in body, unshakable in spirit. He returned from prison again and again, each time greeted by crowds that stretched farther than the eye could see. People wept when they saw him. Old men folded their hands. Mothers lifted their children so they could witness the man who had given hope to a land drowning in silence for centuries. Gandhi did not see himself as a hero. He felt like a simple man carrying a responsibility far greater than his shoulders could bear. Yet he carried it anyway. But freedom did not arrive on a gentle wind. It came through storms, some created by the empire, and some born from the wounds of the nation itself. Darkness began to spread across India, not from foreign rule, but from within. As independence approached, old divisions grew sharper. The land trembled under the weight of fear. Communities that had lived together for generations began to drift apart, their hearts clouded by suspicion. Voices rose, not in unity, but in anger. And Gandhi, who had spent his life stitching people together, watched helplessly as his beloved India began to tear at the seams. He walked into the fires, hoping to calm them with his presence. He stood between crowds, pleading for peace. His voice broke sometimes. His eyes filled with sorrow. He moved from village to village like a healer trying to mend a wound that refused to close. Each night, he lay down with a heaviness that pierced even his resilient heart. Then came the day the British finally stepped back. The chains that had bound India for centuries snapped at last. The tricolor rose into the sky for the first time, trembling in the fresh wind of freedom. Celebrations erupted across cities and villages. People danced, cried, embraced the dream their ancestors had carried through generations. But Gandhi did not celebrate. He walked alone through streets where silence had replaced laughter. He passed burned homes, broken families, abandoned childhoods scattered like ashes on the ground. His heart felt heavier than ever before. This was the freedom he had fought for, yet the cost had carved deep scars into the land he loved. Still, he refused to give up. Even in the final chapter of his life, he kept walking, kept praying, kept believing that human hearts could find their way back to compassion. He fasted for peace, offering his own body as a plea for unity. People who had lost themselves to anger returned to their senses when they heard he refused food. Village by village, city by city, the flames began to settle. Gandhi's frail frame had once again moved a nation. But time, like a river, carries even the strongest souls toward their final dawn. The morning light in Delhi was soft on the day Gandhi took his last walk. He stepped out slowly, leaning on the arms of those beside him, his sandals touching the cool earth with gentle familiarity. The sky above was calm, almost tender, as if it knew a chapter in the world's story was reaching its final line. He walked toward the garden where people waited to pray with him. His steps were small but steady. The crowd parted respectfully as he passed, their eyes filled with reverence for the old man who had given his entire life to the service of truth. Gandhi lifted his hands in greeting, his smile faint but warm. And then, in one quiet moment that felt like the world itself stopped breathing, darkness struck. A sudden sound cut through the air. A burst of chaos. A shock that shook the earth beneath countless feet. Gandhi's frail body fell forward, his white cloth fluttering like a final whisper in the wind. His lips moved softly, offering the same name he had carried in his prayers since childhood. And then, silence. A silence so deep it seemed to reach into every home, every heart, every corner of the nation he had raised from despair. People stood frozen, unable to believe the gentle light that had guided them through storms had been taken away. The sky above grew dim as if mourning with them. Across India, candles were lit. Tears fell like rain. For a moment, even time seemed to bow its head. But Gandhi's story did not end with that silence. It lived in every village that remembered his footsteps. It lived in every hand that spun cotton in quiet dignity. It lived in every voice that refused violence. It lived in every heart that learned to stand for truth, no matter the cost. He had entered the world as a timid boy, afraid of shadows. He left as a light that would never fade. The man was gone, but the message he carried, of courage without hate, of freedom without cruelty, of strength born from gentleness, remained like an eternal flame, guiding generations long after his final breath. And somewhere in the vast, restless silence of history, the soft echo of his footsteps still lingers, reminding the world that a single life, lived with pure truth, can change the destiny of millions. Night settled gently over the newly freed nation, but India felt different now. It was a land carrying both victory and grief in the same breath. People walked with the pride of independence, yet their shoulders carried the weight of a loss they could not describe. Gandhi's absence was like a quiet emptiness that followed them everywhere, a silence that lived between footsteps, between heartbeats, between the soft rustle of the tricolor waving in the evening wind. In towns and cities, people spoke of him not as a leader but as someone who had become part of their own lives. Mothers told their children stories of the gentle man who walked miles under the sun so they could one day walk freely. Old men remembered the first time they saw him, how he stood barefoot on dusty ground, speaking words that felt like water to a thirsty soul. Women clutched the memories of how he had lifted their pain with a single promise of dignity. And children, who had never met him, imagined him as someone who might walk through their village lanes at dawn, blessing the fields with his quiet presence. The nation moved forward, but it carried him within its heartbeat. And far from the noise of streets and the weight of politics, there was a deeper story, one written not in speeches or battles but in the small, almost invisible moments of his life. The way he folded his clothes slowly, as if respecting even the simplest fabric. The way he bowed his head before speaking, letting silence shape his thoughts. The way he walked, with tiny steps, as though each footstep was a prayer offered to the earth. These little things became memories that floated through the air long after he was gone. People found themselves repeating the same gestures, waking early, helping neighbors, speaking softly, offering forgiveness. And without realizing it, they kept him alive through the very values he had lived for. In the villages he once walked through, the earth still seemed to remember him. Children playing near old banyan trees would often pause, imagining the faint sound of a walking stick tapping the ground. Women drawing water from wells felt a strange warmth as if someone was blessing their labor. Farmers resting under the sun believed the wind carried his voice, telling them to stand with courage no matter how difficult the days became. Even the rivers that flowed across the land seemed to carry his story. Their waters glimmered under sunlight like threads of truth weaving through the land he loved. People stood by those rivers and felt his presence, not in the ripples, but in the calm beneath them. And somewhere in this vast country, hidden in the quiet corners of memory, lived the thought that perhaps Gandhi had never truly left. Perhaps he had simply dissolved into the soul of India, becoming part of its dust, its fields, its skies, its heartbeat. His teachings were no longer words spoken on stages, they had become the air itself. Invisible, yet always felt. Years passed, and India slowly began to heal. The wounds of partition softened. The fire of anger cooled. New dreams grew in the soil once wet with tears. Roads expanded, cities rose, technologies changed, but Gandhi's shadow walked beside every change, reminding the nation of the values that shaped its freedom. There were moments when the world seemed to drift away from truth, moments when hatred tried to return, moments when fear tried to divide hearts. But in those moments, India looked back at the fragile figure who had led without a sword, without wealth, without armies. And the memory of him softened the edges of despair. Children learned his story not as a lesson, but as a tale of human possibility. Young people carried his message like a lantern guiding their uncertain paths. The elderly whispered his name with a tenderness that felt like a prayer. And travelers from distant lands visited the places he once walked, searching for the secret of the man who defeated an empire with nothing but truth. Time flowed, years layered upon years, but some things did not fade. The spinning wheel still symbolized dignity. The white cloth still carried purity. The folded hands still carried humility. And the gentle heart still carried courage. Gandhi's journey had ended, but his story lived on, in streets that echoed with his footsteps, in hearts that carried his hope, in a nation shaped by his quiet courage. Even as generations changed, the essence of his struggle remained like an old song that never loses its meaning. A reminder that the loudest strength is often found in silence. That the greatest victories are won without violence. That the most powerful revolutions begin inside a single human soul. He began as a boy afraid of darkness, unsure of his place in the world. He grew into a man who lit lamps in the darkest corners of human suffering. He left as a guiding light that no blade, no hatred, no bullet could extinguish. A life lived with truth becomes a flame that continues to glow long after the body disappears. And somewhere in the vast horizon where history meets memory, Gandhi's flame still burns, soft, steady, eternal, reminding every generation that humanity becomes strongest when it chooses love over fear, peace over anger, courage over surrender. His voice may have fallen silent the day he left the world, but his message still walks through every street of India. In the gentle footsteps of those who believe that one person, no matter how humble, can change the destiny of millions. Thanks for watching. If this story added even a little spark to your mindset, don't forget to like the video. Hit subscribe and tap the bell icon so you never miss our next drop. From motivational book summaries, to famous personality stories, to life growth lessons that level up your English and your thinking. Keep learning, keep growing, This is English Amplify, signing off.